Our guest tonight, Skip Brack, is Professor of Literature Emeritus at way out west at Arizona State University. And he is one of the world's great authorities on the life of Samuel Johnson. And who was Sam Johnson? Well, I'm betting that most of you know, but for those of you who don't, very quickly, one of England's great men of letters, the 18th century dictionary maker, essayist, poet, conversationalist extraordinaire, whose life we know primarily from James Boswell's biography, which is arguably the greatest biography in the English language. It was published in 1791. That, however, was hardly the first biography of Johnson, although it remains certainly the best known biography of Johnson. But 4 years before that, in 1787, there was another biography of Johnson published called, amazingly enough, The Life of Samuel Johnson. And it was written by Sir John Hawkins, who was quite a good acquaintance of Dr. Johnson, and in fact knew many things about him that Boswell didn't know. There was even a little competition between Boswell and Johnson, which perhaps our guest may talk about tonight. But Hawkins' biography has been largely away from readers for many, many years. It's just not been accessible except in some libraries. And now the University of Georgia Press has brought out an extraordinarily handsome new edition of Hawkins' biography of Sam Johnson. And our guest has edited this and with notes and has shown us why we need to know this biography in addition to Boswell to have a much clearer picture of just who Dr. Johnson really was. And so to tell us about Dr. Johnson and about the privileges and responsibilities of authorship, please welcome Dr. Skip Brack.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just a little plug for Sir John. He met Johnson in November of 1738. Boswell was born in 1740. So most of the information about the early life that Boswell has, he got from Hawkins. So until you get to the conversation part in the Boswell life, he's rated that from Hawkins. And but he's so it's a rather sad story actually. He and his cohorts so damaged Hawkins' reputation that this is the first edition of the biography since the second edition appeared in 1787. And I tried for 20 years to get it published and no one would do it. And so it was really kind of sad. And you know, it was just competition. But what makes it worse is that Hawkins was already dead. And you know, to keep attacking a man's reputation when he could only hurt his family, he had 2 sons and a daughter, you know, it seems particularly vicious to me. And because Hawkins died in 1789, you know, they attacked the style and that sort of thing, and it's not as well written as Boswell, but he was 67, 68 years old when he was writing this biography, and that would be like writing a biography now if you were 90, because most people died in their late 40s or early 50s, so he was really quite an old man, and I don't know that his memory was as reliable as he thought it was, but anyway, there may be some old man stories in the biography, but in any case, there is a lot of new information that is in other places, and I enjoyed reading it. And let me just say this, I'm very indebted to Georgia. I have also edited a 10-volume edition of the works of Tobias Smollett, the 18th century Scottish novel. The last 3 volumes are at various stages in the press, but it was published by the University of Georgia Press. And so when the Tercentenary came along, Nancy Grayson, who's now the executive editor and acquisition editor at the University of Georgia Press, I teased her, I said, I knew you when you were a girl. She was the copy editor of the first volume of the Smollett edition that appeared in 1988. And so we've known each other all these years. And all of a sudden, about a year before the Tercentenary, I had this brilliant idea. I said, I've already published 7 books with Georgia Press. I'm going to call Nancy and see if she'd be interested. And I called her, and she said, bless her heart, I called her and she said, well, we're not doing much 18th century. We've started doing mostly American now. And of course, as you know, a lot of Georgia books. And I said, and she said, but I think it's a good idea. We should have a role in the Tercentenary, and you're the person to do it. And the quarterly meeting of the press is this Friday. This is like Tuesday. And she said, can you get a proposal to me? So I dusted off one of these proposals I've been sending around for years. Fortunately, it was in my computer. And I dusted it off, and I made a little Tercentenary pitch, and she said, well, I'll try to sell it to the board. And anyway, and then I'll call you after the board meeting. Well, I guess I was so excited that what I did was I gave her my wife's cell phone number. So I'm waiting, and of course it comes by, and she said, oh, the meeting will probably be over at 5 or 5:30. And of course, there's 3 hours difference, So I'm waiting at the office to hear from her, and I don't hear. It's 6, and I think, well, by now she's gone home. And so finally my wife calls, and she said, Nancy just called and said she thought she was going to talk to you, but she had my phone number. And so she said that the board has agreed to publish your book, and she's going to try to get in touch with you. I gave her your cell phone number. And so sure enough, just about the time I finished talking to my wife, my phone rang, and she said, okay. Well, one little more bit to this story. I had never, and I published about 20 books, I had never gotten a contract for a book ahead of time. And I got a contract for this book. And it was due October the 1st, 2007. Well, this was in the spring, you see, that I had agreed to do this. I mean, in the fall, that I agreed to do this, and I thought I had a sabbatical leave in the spring, and I had the semester off. And I had applied for a sabbatical leave, and the sabbatical leave went to all the way through the committee in the department, signed off by the chair, went to the dean's committee, they signed off on it, the dean signed off of it, and when it got on the secretary's desk, she realized that I'd applied a year early. And so I had this contract to finish this book, and I had to teach full-time. I spent a lot of time in the office on the weekends, needless to say, but I did do it, and I sent it off on October the 3rd. And a never-to-be forgotten experience. Let me apologize ahead of time. I have to stop quite often and drink water. I was treated for cancer of the throat in the spring, and I had 38 radiation treatments, and it just destroyed my salivary glands, and they're supposed to come back at some point, but I don't know when that's going to be. So when I talk, my throat gets terribly, terribly dry, and this really is water. And not martini or something. Okay. Well, since this is the Tercentenary, I'm going to talk a little bit about Johnson, but I wanted to just talk about professional authorship because Johnson, who was born in 1709, he was really the first generation where it was possible for a writer to make a living by writing. You have periodicals, you have the Gentleman's Magazine that was founded in 1731. It's the first magazine that was founded. Johnson worked for it. And so there were ways to pick up money that hadn't existed before. Writers before that usually had to have some patronage. They dedicate their books to somebody and they give them some money, and then they make whatever they could sell their books for to a bookseller. There was no royalty system. You sold the manuscript to the bookseller, what we call the publisher now. A publisher was something different in the 18th century. And you sold it to the bookseller, and let's just say if you stole it for 30 pounds, that was it. And if it went through 100 editions, unless the bookseller wanted to give you some more money, you didn't get any. That was it. So then you had to go on to your next project. So you can see it was tough. And very few people in the 18th century got movie rights for their books. And for that matter, very few people do now. And so it really hasn't changed very much. Very, very few people, John Gresham or somebody, that really are bestsellers, can make a living writing books, what we would call belles lettres, poems and novels and that sort of thing. If you stop and think about it, let's just say the New York Times Book Review, if you look at the reviewer, they're paid to review. If you look, it says so-and-so is publishing their new novel in next month or something like that. Well, why are they writing reviews instead of writing more novels? Well, they're writing reviews because they need the money. And so they review regularly for these organs. Anthony Burgess, who Clockwork Orange, and it was a very famous British writer who died about a decade ago, he reviewed books in the Sunday Observer every single Sunday, 52, and he'd published 15, 20 novels and whatever. Some of them had even been made into movies. And he still, he was paid a couple £100 to review, and he reviewed a book. And you just think you'd have to read the book and then review it every single week. So being a professional writer is still tough. Now, a lot of writers, of course, are English professors, and they have to do other things. But all this starts in the 18th century, and so I want to preface this by saying most writers never made it. They were called Grub Street. Not everybody lived in Grub Street, but it was a place where it was cheap housing and people made their living translating and this sort of thing. So what I want to do is look a little bit at Johnson's career, because his path follows that of professional writers in the 18th century, and it isn't that much different from any writer you might meet now. And of course, he finally makes it. He's lived half of his life. He's 46 years old when the dictionary comes out. It's the first comprehensive dictionary in the English language. And it's influenced every dictionary up till now. Even the OED is James Murray, who was the editor of the New English Dictionary on Historical Principles, it was called, and then because Oxford published it, eventually became the Oxford English Dictionary, and the OED had a copy of Johnson's dictionary on a table in the middle of the room for his staff to consult. So it's so Johnson can be said to really have changed the English language forever in 1755 when he published his dictionary. But he didn't have any reputation at all, really, till the dictionary came out and he was 46 years old. What were you doing when you were 46 years old? There's a couple of people out here a little older than 46. Are you 46? I won't go there. Okay. Well, I'm 70, so I've got it over you. I want to read you a couple of quotes before I do Johnson, and I told you about Smollett, and I just want to set the stage, the mood, if you wish. This is Smollett talking. He says, he wrote a letter to Samuel Richardson. Some of you may know Samuel Richardson. He wrote Pamela, Clarissa. But he was also a printer. And Smollett was editing a huge dictionary called Universal History. And Richardson was the bookseller sort of in charge of it, and so he's corresponding. So Smollett's having to do all this work, writing every day. He wrote so much, you can't even imagine copying all of that much material, never mind writing it. He published something like 80 volumes, and his career only lasted 20 years. He died at 50. Well, you can understand he was exhausted. He says, other tradesmen can acquire wealth by employing a number of good hands under their immediate direction, but an author of genius and reputation must, it seems, be a journeyman for life and be obliged to subsist by the labor of his own hands. And then Johnson in The Adventurer. Well, the dictionary is still a year away. Here's what he has to say about authors and their complaints. He says, if we apply to authors themselves for an account of their state, it will appear very little to deserve envy, for they have in all ages been addicted to complaint. The neglect of learning, the ingratitude of the present age, and the absurd preference by which ignorance and dullness often obtain favor and rewards have been from age to age topics of invective, and few have left their names to posterity without some appeal to future candor from the perverseness and malice of their own times. I have nevertheless been often inclined to doubt whether authors, however querulous, are in reality more miserable than their fellow mortals. The present life is to all a state of infelicity. Every man, like an author, believes himself to merit more than he obtains. And solaces the present with the prospect of the future. Others indeed suffer their disappointments in silence, of which the writer complains to show how well he has learned the art of lamentation. So this provides a little context. So at least Johnson had a sense of humor about his project. Oh, okay. All students of Johnson know that any project on Johnson starts with his dictionary. If you read Johnson scholarly books, or for that matter, if you look at my Hawkins, you'll see that people are often quoting Johnson's dictionary because, as you know, words have changed their meaning, and so people consult Johnson's dictionary because, after all, the first edition came out in 1755. That's right in the middle of the century, and then he revised it a little bit, and the fourth edition is revised, and it came out in 73. So it's still being consulted by scholars. And you'll see, I don't know how many times I quoted in the Hawkins, but it's quite a bit. So the story of Johnson's achievement is one of those stories of, it's become almost legendary. It's like those stories of our youth, of Jack the Giant Killer or something like that. He compiled a dictionary single-handedly. He had amanuenses, but he did this himself, that has 116,000 definitions. I mean, it has 42,000 definitions and 116,000 illustrative quotations. And he did the dictionary backwards. Now, what you would do if you were going to compile a dictionary, as you would make a word list, right? So you'd know what words need to be defined. Then you'd probably use some other dictionaries, and then you'd straighten it up yourself. Johnson did use some other dictionaries as sort of word list to make sure he had everything, he hadn't left something out. He says in the preface that he got all the way to the end and he realized that he had left out C, S-E-A. What he did, and this is what I mean by doing it backwards, what he did was he had a very tenacious memory. He read books from his library and books he could borrow. And every time he came across a word that he wanted in the dictionary, he underlined it, he bracketed however much he wanted to use in the illustrated quotation. And let's just say lecture, L. He'd put an L in the margin. And then he would hand the book to an amanuensis who would copy this out on slips and paste it in big books. And then the amanuensis, the different ones, one person would mark it with one line, 1, 2, 1, 3, so he'd know who did it. But all of the definitions, except a few technical, where he cites his source, he says he's got it from this other dictionary, because he wasn't a scientist. Everything was, all the words were defined by him. All the quotations were selected by him. And the way he defined the words was by how they were used. Now, you do this all the time when you read, right? And it's only when you think you know what the word means and it doesn't fit the context that you think, maybe I better look this up in the dictionary. Well, if you read 18th century books, oftentimes you come across a word and you don't know what it means. And so you have to go to Johnson's dictionary to look it up, or the OED, of course. It's online to define the word. But this man did the entire dictionary by context. Now, he thought he was going to do it in 3 years. And he ended up doing it in 9. But could you imagine compiling a dictionary single-handedly in 9 years? I mean, I've been talking about this for 45 years, and I still can't believe it. Every time I pick up the dictionary and look at it, I think I can't believe that one person did this, even in a lifetime. It is absolutely an astonishing piece of work. And the reason that it took more than 3 years is because he published a plan of the dictionary saying how he was going to do it. Well, like most plans, you know how it goes. The best laid plans of bison men often go awry. This went awry. And so he had 3 years worth of money from the booksellers, 1,575 pounds. Well, it was quite a bit of money at the time. But he had to pay the amanuenses, he had to buy his paper. All that came out of that money. And after he had worked on it for 3 years, he found out his system didn't work. And he had to start over. Now, of course, he rescued some of the material and put it, and some of it shows up in the revised version, but it was really disheartening. And so then, he hadn't wasted entirely 3 years, but he might have done it in 5 if he hadn't had this, disaster. I think that's the only thing that you can call. Well, I had a little shtick about using Johnson's dictionary. I was asked a couple of weeks ago to give a lecture about Johnson's dictionary, and I ended up giving a talk, as I'm doing now. And I thought, everybody know what a lecture is? You probably thought you were going to hear one tonight, right? And instead, you're getting a talk. And I thought, I've never looked in Johnson's dictionary to see what a lecture is. I wonder what he said a lecture was. Maybe I'm not giving a lecture after all. Maybe I'm doing something completely different. I better find out. So I went to the dictionary and I looked up lecture to see what he said. Well, first of all, he gives Johnson, like most English in the period, was pretty anti-French. They were traditional enemies, and if you know anything about English history in the 18th century, they're battling with the French the whole century. Well into the 19th century with the Napoleonic Wars, but you remember what we call the French and Indian War. It called it the 7 Years' War in England. It's really the fight as to who's going to colonize North America, right? no one except Johnson said that, wait a minute, there's somebody already living there. You know, he said that it was like two robbers fighting over the spoils of a coach. It didn't belong to either one of them, but they, you know, as you know, you used to remember this from school, they fought it out anyway. So first of all, the etymology of lecture is French, so that already tells you something about Johnson. He didn't much care for French words. He has some rather nasty things to say about the French. The irony is that, of course, when he came to London in 1737, the way he made his living was translating from the French for the booksellers. And this is what most people did, because the middle class, which was the merchant class, did not have the education of the upper classes and the gentry. The upper classes went to grammar school, and grammar school was Latin grammar. And people who were going to be printers or carpenters or something, they went to school to about age 12, you know, the reading, writing, and arithmetic sort of thing that we did, you know, in elementary school. As a matter of fact, if you're of a certain age like me, elementary school was called grammar school. It was called grammar school when I went to school. And I can tell you, we were beaten over the head with grammar rules in English, you know, diagramming sentences and all that. But Johnson spent most of his time translating French. And you got paid by how much copy would fill a printed sheet. A printed sheet would be, you know, printed on one side, then you turn it over and print it on the other. The amount of copy that would fill one of these printed sheets that would then be folded up into a gathering to make a book, it was anywhere from a half a guinea to a guinea. A guinea is a pound 1 shilling. It's not a lot of money. And so in order to live, you just have to just keep doing it. And the reason that there was a market for this is because this is when the consumer society begins. And you have all these people who are out working, who have their own shops, they're merchants, they have disposable income, they can buy periodicals, they can buy books, they're very eager to educate themselves. They can't read Homer in Greek, they can't read Virgil in Latin, but they want to read them. So they'll be educated people. And so how are they going to read them? They're going to read them in English. And so there's this army of people who are out there working away, translating all these classical texts, French, whatever, into English. Alexander Pope, who's the most famous poet in the period, made a fortune by translating the Iliad and the Odyssey. In fact, he bought himself a great big house out in Twickenham, which was out in the country in those days. He bought himself a big estate just from translating the Iliad. So he made that much money. So there was demand for these kinds of things. So that's what you had to do. You see, you had to, you had to go where the money was if you're going to stay alive. And there's this middle class who is very eager to have these. Well, anyway, Johnson later in the preface of the dictionary was going to say that whoever knows the English tongue in its present extent will be able to express his thoughts without further help from other nations, and from other nations read France. That's from Rambler 208, his last Rambler essay. And then he says in the dictionary, the preface of the dictionary says, the great pest of speech, you can add writing as well, is frequency of translation. No book was ever turned from one language into another without imparting some of its native imagery. And you know that's true. I mean, we read translations and we think we're reading the original right, but we know we're really not. If we could read Greek or we could read Latin or we could read French, book probably wouldn't sound quite the same. And what he means is, of course, the syntax. And if you look at Johnson's translations, for example, when he's rested, he takes the French and he turns it into English sentences. You can tell as you go through the book when he gets tired, because you all had foreign language classes. You remember what you did, right? You just translate the words. They don't necessarily make sense in English, right? I mean, if you translate all the Spanish words or all the French words or all the German words and use their syntax, it doesn't make a lot of sense, especially if it's German, because the verb's at the end. Doesn't happen that often in English, right? So anyway, let me just give you a little, a lecture is a discourse pronounced on any subject. Well, now that's sufficiently vague, right? But I suppose I am giving a lecture if you believe that. Well, what's a discourse? Johnson, in the preface to the dictionary, talks about the fact that how difficult it is to define small words. Because what happens? You have to use more abstruse words, right, to define simple words, right? And what about words like passerby? Well, you're not supposed to use the same word, right, in the definition, but what are you going to say except one who passes by? You think of another definition? You see the problem. So anyway, the assumption is here that you know what a discourse is. What is a discourse? Well, it's a conversation, mutual intercourse of language. Talk, he says. That's sense 2. Sense 3 is a fusion of language, speech. Sense 4, it's a treatise, a dissertation written or uttered. Well, what's a dissertation? A discourse, a disquisition, a treatise. Wait a minute, what's a disquisition? It's an examination, a disputive inquiry. Well, what's a treatise then? It's a discourse. It's a written tractate. Now, what's a tractate? Well, I think we'll stop there. But you see what I'm saying. We're eventually going to go in a circle, a great, huge circle. You know, we're going to have to look up all these words. I have a wonderful note. It's my favorite note in Hawkins, where Hawkins uses the word loopy. I didn't know what a loopy is. Anybody know what a loopy is? Well, it's it's sort of like dope, or, those kind of words that we toss around, and we say, oh, what a dope, or something, or turkey. Now, of course, Johnson would never figure out why we, said, oh, that turkey, I guess because turkeys are supposed to be stupid. But anyway, the point is that you look up Loopy, and then he uses other words of the same kind, like dope or something that you don't know, and then you look those up, and you look up, and you go round and round and round, you look them up, and when you get to about the 6th one, it's Loopy. He defines it as Loopy. And so none of these words, I must say, are still in use. But it's it's somebody that doesn't have good sense, or ars lazy, or a lout of some sort. Anyway, and so this happened. But anyway, you can see the problem. To lecture, he says, is to instruct formally. That's sense 1. But listen to sense 2, and then you'll really be glad that I decided not to lecture. To instruct insolently and dogmatically. So you can see why I decided not to do that. And he says, in Boswell, he says, people have nowadays got a strange opinion that everything should be taught by lectures. Now, I cannot see that lectures can be of much good as reading the books from which the lectures came. We had teachers like that when we were in college, right? Who basically just kind of paraphrase the textbook for you, and you think, well, I just read that. Here I've got to sit here for 50 minutes and listen to this. He says, I know nothing that can best be taught by lectures except where experiments are being shown. You may teach chemistry by lectures. You can teach making of shoes by lectures. Well, that really persuaded me, because I thought, well, Johnson wouldn't want to be the subject of a lecture, obviously. And I don't intend to do any experiments. I can't even juggle. Okay. So anyway, I traced this circle out till I came back like the Loopy. Okay. I could give a speech. That's an oration or a harangue. Or an oration, which is a speech made according to the laws of rhetoric. A harangue, a declamation. I could have a conversation, or give an address, a colloquy, a commentary, a confabulation, a declamation, a declaration, a discussion, a discourse, a disquisition, a dissertation. I could educate, give an exhortation, an explication, an explanation, an exposition. I could expound, give a harangue, a homily. I could institute, provide instruction, give a lesson, observations, a prelection, a proclamation, a pronouncement, remarks, report, sermon, a speech. I could teach, give a thesis, a tirade, a treatise, a tutorial, an utterance. I might also gossip, prate, and tattle. That's a big circle. But anyway, it points out the difficulties of trying to compile a dictionary, right? Because you have to use some of the same words. Obviously, one of the things you notice here is discourse keeps coming up quite a bit. So I would suggest that, whenever you come one of these, if you're not sure what it means, you better look it up, because you'll probably see it again. Okay. Well, let me talk about Johnson here very quickly. Johnson came to London in 1737, and he had written a tragedy, and it's I don't know, you can't really say anything kind about it. It has some good poetry in it, but it's the kind of play you'd write if you were growing up in a little provincial town, and you'd read classics, and maybe Racine and Corneille, but you knew nothing about stagecraft whatsoever. And then he comes to London with this play, which is mostly just declamation. It's just talk. Nothing much happens in the play. And the reason he wants to be a playwright is because when it eventually does appear 10 years later, when his friend David Garrick is the manager at Drury Lane, it runs for 3 nights, is because the way authors were paid for their plays is every 3rd night that the play ran, you would get the profits after the expenses, for candles and that sort of thing for the night. You would get the remainder, and it was about 100 pounds. So if it ran 9 nights, you got about 300 pounds. That's a lot of money. Later, Johnson in 1762 gets a pension, and it's 300 pounds a year. So it was a lot of money. So you can see why he wanted to do it. Well, of course, it doesn't work. And so then of course, he has a little money when he comes to town, but of course the money runs out, and he hasn't gotten the play. Part of it was because the 2 main theaters that produced plays only produced 2 main pieces on average every season. What they did, of course, so they wouldn't have to pay the author, they do Shakespeare, they translate, there's no copyright, they translate French plays into English and kind of anglicize them some way and perform them. And that way they didn't have to pay the author. So they only did this twice. So what's the odds of Johnson getting his play on stage? Virtually nil. Now, what Johnson decides that he writes to Edward Cave, and who's the editor of the Gentleman's Magazine. And so he starts working for him, writing squibs. Almost all this stuff is anonymous. Now, Johnson really wants fame. he had to drop out of Oxford after 13 months because he didn't have any money. He basically went, in the English system, he went 4 terms. And of course he knew that there were all these people who were nowhere near as intelligent as he was and managed to get their degrees only because their parents had money and his didn't. His father was just a provincial bookseller in Litchfield. And he resented this, and you can understand why, because this cut him off from all the professions. If you were going to be a barrister, a lawyer, you had to have a degree from Oxford, Cambridge, a physician, you know. So it just cut him off from from a professional life. And what he really wanted to be was a scholar. And of course, it's very hard to be a scholar unless you're independently wealthy, or at a university, right? Well, you're not going to get a job without a degree, so he didn't have a degree. So what he does is he writes all of these squibs. Some of them are very good, essays. You know, he writes a whole string of biographies, a life of Sir Francis Drake and Admiral Blake, who was a very famous admiral during the Dutch Wars, and various people, you know, 18th century people. A man named Herman Boerhaave, who was a very distinguished Dutch physician, late 17th, early 18th century, back when the Dutch had the best medical schools. Oxford and Cambridge didn't have medical schools. And so he decides he wants to be a scholar, and he proposes that he's going to translate, as strange as this seems, you can imagine trying to read this, a book called The History of the Council of Trent, which was written by Father Paul Sarpi, who was a Venetian. And this was a very important counter-Reformation document, and there was a lot of interest in the time. So there would have been an audience for it. But the point is that the proposals had his name in great big letters on it. So had this succeeded, of course, people would have known who Samuel Johnson was. I mean, he can write for the Gentleman's Magazine forever. No one's going to know who he is. He's Mr. Nobody. Well, he tries to do this. There's supposedly going to be a rival edition, and it doesn't. The rival edition doesn't go either, and it ends up with no translation. But in the meantime, and Johnson had already gotten quite a bit of money, 47 pounds, and depending on whether he got a half guinea or a guinea a sheet, if he got a guinea, he translated a quarter of an 800-page great big quarto book in French, or if he only got a half a guinea, he translated half of it. That would have been 400 pages. You should see the book, too. I don't think anybody here will probably rush out. I don't think I need to say much about it. I don't think anybody's going to rush out and read it. It is in English, incidentally. But I've somehow managed to resist the temptation so far. Oh, the only thing that Johnson gets out of this is the first biography that he writes for the Gentleman's Magazine is the life of Father Paul Sarpi, which obviously he's just abstracted from what was going to be the life at the beginning of the thing. So that fails. So anyway, he keeps writing. He publishes a poem, you know, London, and maybe he gets 10 pounds for it. Well, 10 pounds isn't going to last very long. You know, and he publishes some political pamphlets. All these are anonymous. I mean, they don't have his name on them, so no one knows who they are. And he publishes some political pamphlets. Well, he probably got a few pounds for those. You know, maybe he felt better for having, you know, offended his spleen, but he didn't make any money. So anyway, he's 36 years old, and he still hasn't made it. And so Robert Dodsley, who was one of the most famous booksellers at the time, and who befriended Johnson, he'd published London for him and given him 10 pounds, proposes the dictionary to him. And so Johnson works on the dictionary. And the obvious question to ask is, why in the world would anybody undertake this? I bet if I ask any of you to do a dictionary, you'd look at me like I'd just, flown in from Mars or someplace. But after the failure of this in 3 years into the project, Johnson starts writing a series of 200 essays called the Rambler Essays. And he doesn't write autobiography. The dictionary isn't mentioned, but he gives himself pep talks. You can recognize that he's talking to himself, and you can overhear him. And here's what, my favorite Rambler essay, here's what he says to himself. He says, well, if you pick a project that's too small, even if it's popular, no one's ever going to know who you are. You publish a little tiny book. So what you have to do is you have to publish a big book. Because then if you have a big book, then your name's on it, and if it's something that people want, then they'll know who you are, and then you'll be famous. But what if you don't finish it? You don't know how long you're going to live, right? Life was really very tenuous in the 18th century. Then what happens? Well, then you're not going to get fame either. So how does he console himself? Well, he's a religious man, so the way he consoles himself, he says, well, there's somebody else keeping score, And the man who's keeping score, what he wants is that you have done your best. And so how he consoles himself is you have to persevere, because even if God doesn't give you enough time to finish, he will think that you did your best and persevered, that you didn't just give up because the project was big. And this is how he consoles himself. Well, he does persevere. And he has these 6 amanuenses. He just keeps giving them material and whatever. So anyway, he produces this, gradually produces this comprehensive dictionary. Now, the obvious question to ask is, who's Samuel Johnson? So he writes a dictionary. So what? Why would you use a dictionary by somebody named Samuel Johnson? What authority does he have to tell us how we ought to be using the language? Right? You don't ask this because you just assume there are authorities, right, who've written your dictionary. But in France, the dictionary was written by 40 academicians. And the same thing in Italy. So the big Italian dictionaries and the big French dictionary were written by, well, for God so loved the world, he didn't send committees. But in any case, you know how committees work. If you really want to just not get much done, just form a committee, and it'll be. I'll pretty much put an end to everything. This is an academic speaking who sat through many committee meetings. Dodsley thinks of this, and he gets the 4th Earl of Chesterfield, who was a man who was very elegant and supposedly knew about the language, and he was a great patron of literature and the arts and all this sort of thing. And so Johnson dedicates his plan to the Earl of Chesterfield. Well, the Earl of Chesterfield just sort of disappears, and Johnson struggles along and struggles along. Well, these booksellers, there are 5 firms, 7 booksellers, but there's 5 firms. And they've already put 1,575 pounds. And when Johnson runs out of money, well, he can't finish the dictionary, right? So you're really, stuck, right? They've already put $1,500 in this. They don't have a dictionary. Johnson can't go on. He doesn't have any money to pay his amanuenses. He doesn't have any money to eat on. The booksellers, needless to say, are pretty upset about this, and so they get very angry, and they decide that they're going to call a meeting. And Johnson says, "No, I'm not going to a meeting." And here's what he says. William Strawn, who was a friend of his, the printer of the dictionary, the booksellers go to him because they know he's a friend of Johnson to pass the word on that they want to meet with him. And he writes back to Strawn. He says, that my resolution has long been and is not now altered, and is now less likely to be altered, that I shall not see the gentlemen partners till the first volume is in the press, which they may forward or retard by dispensing or not dispensing with the last message. Be pleased to lay my determination before them this morning, for I shall think of taking my measures accordingly tomorrow evening. Only this, that I mean no harm, but that my citadel shall not be taken by storm while I can defend it, and that if a blockade is intended, the country is under my command of my batteries, and I shall think of laying it under contribution. So what are they going to do? Well, they've got all this money invested, but they don't have a dictionary, so what do they decide to do? They decide to pay him for each printed sheet, each sheet that, so Johnson tends to win. Anyway, so he won that battle. So anyway, he works along. Well, what happens is that Chesterfield surfaces in December of 1754. Johnson hasn't seen him since 1746. And he puffs the dictionary, two of the silliest essays you'd ever want to read. He puffs the dictionary in this sort of periodical sheet called The World that just happens to be owned by Robert Dodsley. Now, Robert Dodsley is the one that got him mixed up with Chesterfield in the first place. Johnson's probably already written the preface by now, and he says that he's compiled this dictionary without any assistance from the grade. And here's Chesterfield acting like he's been patronizing this thing all along, and Johnson's never gotten a thing. And so Johnson decides that he will teach the great Earl of Chesterfield some manners. So this is the letter he wrote. This is probably the most famous letter in the 18th century. He says, "My Lord, I have been lately informed by the proprietor of the World that 2 papers in which my dictionary is recommended to the public were written by your lordship. To be so distinguished is an honor which, being very little accustomed to favors from the great, I know not how to receive or in what terms to acknowledge. When upon some slight encouragement I first visited your lordship, I was overpowered like the rest of mankind by the enchantment of your address, and could not forbear to wish that I might obtain that regard for which I saw the world contending. But I found my attendance so little encouraged that neither pride nor modesty would suffer me to continue it. When I had once addressed your lordship in public, I had exhausted all the art of pleasing which a retired and uncourtly scholar can possess. I had done all that I could, and no man is well pleased to find his all neglected, be it ever so little. 7 years, my lord, now passed since I waited at your outward rooms and was repulsed from your door. Through difficulties to which it is useless to complain, I have brought it to the last verge of publication without one act of assistance, one word of encouragement, or one smile of favor. Such treatment I did not expect, for I never had a patron before. Is not a patron, my lord, one who looks with unconcern on a man struggling for life in the water, and when he's reached ground, encumbers him with help? The notice which you have been pleased to take of my labors, had it been early, had been kind, but it has been delayed till I am indifferent and cannot enjoy it, till I'm solitary and cannot impart it, till I am known and do not want it. I hope it's no very critical asperity not to confess obligation where no benefit has been received, or to be unwilling that the public should consider me as owing that to a patron which Providence has enabled me to do for myself. Having carried on my work thus far with so little obligation to any favor of learning, I shall not be disappointed, though I shall conclude it, if less be possible, with less. For I have long been awakened from the dream of hope in which I once boasted myself with so much exultation, my Lord, your lordship's most humble and most obedient servant, Samuel Johnson. Well, very quickly, of course, this gossip, not new. London is a relatively small city. Of course, this gets around. And I must say, in Chesterfield's credit, he left it out on a table in his hallway for people to see. He knew he had gotten his comeuppance. Well, anyway, to wrap this story up, Johnson, he's gotten a little fame now from the Rambler. People call him Mr. Rambler. And he is now has a reputation as a moralist. Now, it's not like the moral majority or that sort of thing. A moralist, as Johnson defines in the dictionary, is a person who advises people about life, you know. So if you read the Rambler Essays, they're very much about practical things, about envy and things that, you know, problems that you come up in daily life. So at the end, a friend of his applies to Oxford to get him an MA so he can put it on the dictionary. Remember, he doesn't have a degree. Oxford, to their credit, does give him an honorary Master of Arts. He puts it on the title page. The dictionary is finally published, and then he becomes Dictionary Johnson for the rest of his life. The rather sad part of this, to sort of wrap up my professional authorship thing, is that, of course, he finally doesn't, he ends up being arrested for debt twice after the dictionary, one after the dictionary is published, because, of course, he's gotten all the money he's going to get from the dictionary. By 1786, he did an abstract version of the dictionary that was less expensive, where he took out all the illustrative quotations. 8 of those were published. 6 of the folio dictionary with the illustrative quotation published. Altogether, 40,000 copies appeared. And the only additional money that Johnson received was for revising it for the 4th edition. So he struggles along. Finally, of course, he's recognized as an authority on the language, never mind Chesterfield. And in 1762, the king gives him a pension for £300, and so ever after he finishes. Let me just, I'm just at the end here, let me just read you a passage, a very moving passage from the preface of the dictionary. This is, his wife has died in the interval while he was working on this. Incidentally, you know, when he says that he's got everyone under his cannons, he was in a garret. And the one house that he lived in London that has survived is the house in which he compiled the dictionary. And so when you're in London, you can go to Gulf Square. It's a museum. You can go upstairs, and you can see where he compiled the dictionary. In this work, when it shall be found that much is omitted, let it not be forgotten that much likewise has been performed. And though no book was ever spared out of tenderness to the author, and the world is little solicitous to know whence proceeded the faults of that which it condemns, yet it may gratify curiosity to inform it that the English dictionary was written with little assistance of the learned, and without any patronage of the great. So he already had written that, so that's why he had to teach Chesterfield some manners. And not in the soft obscurities of retirement, or under the shelter of academic bowers, but amidst inconvenience and distraction and sickness and sorrow. It may repress the triumph of malignant criticism to observe that if our language is not here fully displayed, I have only failed at an attempt which no human powers have hitherto completed. If the lexicons of ancient languages, how immutably fixed and comprised in a few volumes, are yet, after the toil of successive ages, inadequate and delusive, if the aggregated knowledge and the cooperating diligence of the Italian academicians did not secure them from the censure of Benign, if the embodied critics of France, when 50 years had been spent on their work, were obliged to change its economy and give the 2nd edition another form, they spent 11 years revising it, I may surely be contented without the praise of perfection, which, if I could obtain in the gloom of solitude, what would it avail me? I protracted my work till most of those whom I wished to please have sunk into the grave, and success and miscarriage are empty sounds. I therefore dismiss it with frigid tranquility, having little to fear or to hope from censure or from praise. I'll give you Johnson's final word on the dictionary. Later, Boswell said to him, well, I bet you didn't know what you were getting into when you decided. I don't think he did, really. What he was in for when he decided to compile a dictionary. This is Johnson, what Johnson said. I knew very well what I was undertaking and very well how to do it, and I have done it very well. Thank you.